Hello everybody and welcome back to this week's video. And in this week's video we're going to once again carry on with the Jeremiah book, of course. And so in this week's video we're going to be looking at the Jeremiah 38th chapter. So without further ado, let us begin with this week's video. So before, of course, we go into the Jeremiah 30th chapter, what did we see in the 37th chapter? To give us a bit of an overview of what we're going to see as a continuation to the 38th. So in the 37th chapter of the Jeremiah book, Babylon is attacking Jerusalem. King Zedekiah asks Jeremiah to pray for the nation. Even though the king asks for prayer, he does not obey God's words. That was the key message we tried to understand last week. And God tells Jeremiah clearly, Babylon will return and destroy the city after the situation where Egypt got in the way to prevent Babylon from taking hostage of Israel, you could say. So do not hope for escape, is what Jeremiah said in the 37th chapter. So Jeremiah faithfully delivers this message, of course. He does not change it to please the king. He does not change it to please the Babylonian kings, we can see. And we can see when And when Jeremiah tries to leave the city, we can see, he is falsely accused of deserting to the Babylonians, we can see. So when he's trying to leave the city, he's falsely accused, we see. And he is beaten and he is put in prison. Later, the king secretly asks Jeremiah once again, is there any word from the Lord? Despite the situation from before, where he says, do not hope for escape, he once again comes cunningly and asks, is there any word from the Lord? And Jeremiah once again honestly answers that, you will be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon, he says. Even then, the king does not obey, though, despite Jeremiah repeating what he had said. He only moves Jeremiah to a better prison. And then, that's where we left off in last week's video and how we're going to come into the Jeremiah 38th chapter. So, in this chapter, Jeremiah continues preaching the same message publicly. If you stay in the city, you will die. If you surrender to Babylon, you will live, he clearly says in the second verse of the chapter. The leaders become angry, though, of course, of this. They say Jeremiah is weakening the people and hurting the war effort, we can see. They ask the king to put him to death. But King Zedekiah, weak and fearful, we can see, allows them to act, we can see. So in this situation, he's actually very scared. And because of this, he did not have his own right judgment and causes them to act upon this. So they throw Jeremiah into a deep pit with no water or mud. He sinks into the mud. He's thrown into a deep pit, we can see, with only mud. There's no water, nothing else, we can see. So he sinks into the mud and is left to die, we can see, in this situation. So he's just left to sink. This shows how far rejection of God's word can truly go to actually escape from it, because of how much they're engrossed in the wrongdoings. Because first, they will ignore that idea. Secondly, they will start to imprison that idea. And then finally, they will try to bury it. But God, of course, does not forget his faithful servant, of course, because he's done everything to supporting the faith and the plan. So a man named Ebed-Melech and an Ethiopian, we can see, the servant who is a servant in the palace, we can see, bravely speaks to the king. And this is a very important thing for us to see. In the 9th verse of the Jeremiah chapter, he says, he boldly approached King Zedekiah, where we can read, as he says in the 9th verse, my lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they did to Jeremiah the prophet, by casting him into the cistern, we can see. And he will die there of hunger, for there is no bread left in the city, he says. He said very boldly in this situation, these men have done evil in all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet, we can see. And he asks that Jeremiah is to be rescued, and the king agrees. And Jeremiah is carefully lifted out of the pit using ropes and old cloths, as said in the 17th to 13th verse is what this story takes place in. And then we can see Jeremiah's life in this situation is spared, though he remained under guard, though, however. Later, though, we can see King Zedekiah secretly meets Jeremiah again, which is very interesting. And he asks for God's counsel, but fears the people more than God, yet again. So Jeremiah tells him plainly, if you obey the Lord and surrender, you will live. Once again, whatever he said to the people, if you obey the Lord and you surrender, you will live. If you refuse, the city will burn. In the 17th to 18th verse, he states this. The king knows the truth, but lacks the courage to act. And that's the truth that we have to understand from this chapter. How much that simple courage that you don't have in your heart causes so much problems for the people around you. Because of Jeremiah has now suffered, he's been thrown into a cistern with only mud and left to die because the king didn't have the courage to say no, let him be as he is, because he fears the people more than the Lord, and that will ultimately lead to your own self-destruction, as it's clearly showing in this chapter, where because of this he's been put in so many problems and situations of unnecessary action, because if he had just shown his courage, then the people and Jeremiah would be in a better position. So what does these two chapters teach us? It shows God's word will not change. God's servant must remain faithful, as Jeremiah did. Fear of people leads to disobedience, we can see like the king showed. And God remembers and rescues those who trusts him, which is very nice as a put off for the end of this video. Because Jeremiah stayed loyal to God, even when the truth put him in prison for the actions and the words he was saying, and in the pit, God brought him back out because he is a true person of faith and here to deliver the Lord's word. So he will never be forgotten for that. And if you refuse to be put in that position, you will experience turmoil after turmoil and will lose that courage as the king is facing, we can clearly see, because he fears the people more than the Lord. One clear thing, we should never be like, because it only leads to our own pity and destruction. So that's all for this week's video, and I'll see you next week. Bye.